Natural assets are really the quantity of biomass and other variables that make up our reality. So natural assets compose biomass, which is sort of like the leaf of this aloe vera plant, and what components make up the growth rate of this aloe vera plant. So like the air, water, temperature, precipitation, everything like that. The world around us is diverse in terms of the natural assets that we have. It is really based upon humans' perspective as to how they really want to categorize them. It's every little component that is part of an ecosystem is a natural asset that we can put a market value into and say that we are benefited by. So that can be trees, flora, fauna, everything. Ecosystem services are metrics that we can place onto an ecosystem as to oftentimes how they benefit humans. We often portray ecosystem services through an anthropocentric lens or through a human-centric lens, where it's the amount of clean air that humans are able to receive from that, or clean water, or clean soil, or the amount of biodiversity, or how much profound cultural and spiritual impact does this ecosystem have on us. When we're trying to value ecosystem services, we're saying in this localized context, the amount of carbon is one of the most valued ecosystem services in the world. The amount of carbon that this tree or ecosystem is sequestering has a value to us as humans that people will pay for. There's often, so that's the carbon market, and the carbon market's in place. There's also non-market values that we could put a monetary value towards. So, for example, there's in Latin America the concept of water funds, and water funds are around ecosystems' ability to provide clean water to populations. And even though the people that are regenerating the water shed and making it to where the population has clean water, often do not get paid enough for the actions that they're doing, there is an economic value that gets provided, which is the amount of clean water that is provided downstream to the population that's benefiting from it. And every ecosystem service that you can think of has the potential to become part of a market and be able to be traded. And it also has greater potential to not have a market value, but be valued in other ways. If we're thinking about the traditional dream factory wants to become a self-reliant community as much as possible and self-sufficient community as much as possible. When we're thinking about the natural assets that the traditional dream factory have that could increase and make up the ability for traditional dream factory to become self-sufficient, it's spaces like the gardens here at the traditional dream factory that provide the food for the people that are residents here at the traditional dream factory to continue to survive. Along with that, we have like the clean air and clean water that are getting provided from the agroforestry systems that are around. In terms of the natural capital assets, we have this food provision from the gardens that are here, but the forests that are around us also help to make sure that there's a reliable quantity of water to maintain these plants alive. And the more that we have this interconnected ecosystem, the more resilient it becomes. And when we place ourselves as a component in this ecosystem that is dependent upon it, we want to make sure that it is as healthy and thriving as possible. So encouraging biodiversity and encouraging the increase of biomass within the traditional dream factory context. Threats to ecosystem services are prevalent throughout this world. We can see them from the human side, where humans are going and creating large infrastructure projects like roads into forests that cut down hundreds and thousands of trees. These roads are then placed with concrete, and the concrete does not provide an ecosystem service besides that of enabling a car to pass on it. So these threats of more urbanization, large-scale sprawl of cities are some of the examples that make up the human threats that we cause ourselves to these ecosystem services. Now, sort of out of our control are non-human threats, and these non-human threats are arguably still sometimes created by humans. So they make up fire, and when the trees get burned and die, they no longer are capable of sequestering the carbon that they used to. And when they fall down, the roots of the tree no longer stabilize the soil like they used to. And that entire microclimate is shifted so that the water retention and the water generation from that ecosystem that gets burned is quite different than when it had an existing ecosystem on it. Other natural disasters like flooding also have an impact on the provision of ecosystem services. When we're thinking about the traditional dream factory context, the traditional dream factory has a goal to set aside 50% of its property to be rewilded. And when that rewilding occurs, there's going to be a greater and greater amount of natural assets that the traditional dream factory is getting benefited by. The traditional dream factory is one such conservation effort in the myriad of conservation efforts around the world that are conserving, maintaining, and increasing the level of ecosystem services that are available to us. A lot of people have experiences with going to parks, and parks are a great example of a space that provide ecosystem services to people. When you go to a park, you're going to experience more clean air than in a very urban context because you have these trees around you that are filtering the air for you. Along with that, your children and yourself included are going to have a relationship to that park that has a cultural significance to you. So if the park ends up getting urbanized at some point and the trees getting cut down, you're going to have an emotional reaction to that. And the more that we're able to encourage and incentivize the conservation and regeneration of natural capital assets within our world, we will get further and further benefits from the ecosystem services that they provide. I've been using this word agroforestry throughout our talk, and a little bit about what agroforestry is. Agroforestry is a practice where instead of the traditional agricultural techniques where you are clearing out a space to only be used for a monoculture of crops, so you're clearing out a space only to plant lettuce. Instead of doing that, what agroforestry techniques do is they're saying, we value biodiversity within our agricultural context. And what we're wanting to do to be able to enable further conditions of biodiversity is plant trees and shrubbery and make our agricultural system look more like a forest itself. So have, from the overstory to the understory, a productive system of agricultural goods that will provide benefits to us, whether it be food or changing of the environment around. If you've been keeping track of the carbon markets, you've been noticing that corporations and governments around the world have been promising to utilize carbon credits to become carbon negative or at least carbon neutral. And this is an increase in the demand for carbon sequestration projects or carbon projects in general. At the same time, there's been a steady to a little bit increasing supply in the amount of carbon credits that are generated from such projects. And when you have an overarching demand with a lesser amount of supply, then the value of carbon credits and other ecosystem service credits are going to be more and more valuable. And what provides those ecosystem service credits is natural capital assets. So natural capital assets in return are going to get more and more valuable over time. And what traditional Dream Factory is doing is that they're increasing the amount of natural capital assets that they have on their property. And when you have these ecosystems that are occurring on land conservation projects like TDF and other community-focused projects around the world, the local communities are going to really help these conservation and regeneration projects to be more and more valuable, because they're going to say that the corporations and industries that are continuing to pollute our world need to really change their practices. And if they're not able to change their practices, at least pay people that are creating a positive difference in this world. So TDF, over time, with the increase in natural capital assets that it has on it, as well as the increase in the value of ecosystem services that are being provided in it, will become a more and more valuable community over time to be part of. One of the reasons I ended up getting really interested in natural capital assets and ecosystem services in particular is because I was living in Paraguay, and I was living right next to a lake that is eutrophic. Eutrophic lake is a lake that has so much nutrients in it that it ends up having excess blooms of algae and making it to where the trophic levels, or the levels of life within that lake, are dying. And this lake was in a very much dying context. And previously, before there was so much urbanization around the lake, people had been writing songs and poetry about the beauty of the lake. And an economic industry of tourism was around the lake. I was in Paraguay witnessing the death of the lake, and I was also witnessing that people, the families that are around this lake, instead of getting paid to maintain and conserve the trees that were on their property, that was going to retain the soil and not let nutrients run into the lake, instead of getting paid to do that, they were cutting down the forests that were on their property to provide livelihoods to their families. And it was a very necessary thing to do. But I wanted to really portray to the local community how deforestation in particular around this lake was having a very negative impact. So I did a study of 2 years of the Lago Ipacari and portrayed that because of deforestation, millions of dollars of economic impact was had on the tourism industry. And not only was the lake dying, but the economic growth of the communities around it. So a lot of the buildings were starting to go into ruin, and a lot of the families that had a relationship with the lake prior were moving elsewhere so that they could provide a better life to their children and to them. So that is really what got me into the entirety of looking at natural capital assets and ecosystem services. And throughout this journey, I've been able to be connected to many different inspiring individuals that are doing projects to increase the level of natural assets that we have available to us and the amount of ecosystem services that we're getting benefited from. Sam from the Traditional Dream Factory is one such individual that is trying to increase, in a very localized context, the level of ecosystem services that are available to a community right next to this very intentional community of regeneration. And another that I've been able to connect with during this refi week has been Jimmy. And Jimmy has planted millions of mangroves around the world. And these mangroves have the ability to protect local coastside communities from tsunamis and other flooding events, as well as provide them areas in which they can go fish and provide more food for their families through that. Mangroves are also one of the best resources in terms of capturing more carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it. So these sorts of projects we're going to see more and more of as the value of regenerating and sustaining the world becomes more and more a priority for us. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the economic cascade that goes into incentivizing this real worldwide regeneration movement. Nature-backed economy in 2050 means that we've really taken into account how each of our actions has a positive or negative effect on the world around us. And we are saying that the thing that we value the most is having a good quality of life, not only for us, but the entirety of the world. And with this value realization, we've now created a framework where for each negative impact we have on the world, we're also doing greater positive good. And this is having a ripple effect into the way that the world looks. It's going to have birds and trees, the flora and fauna of each of the ecosystems that we have a relationship with, increasing and further abundance throughout the world. So nature becomes very indistinguishable from our urban context. And we've come to the realization that we are one in this sort of world.